The Battle of the Bulge lasted from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945. Over 600,000 American troops fought, making it the largest U.S. battle of World War II. Nearly 19,000 Americans were killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. General McAuliffe's "nuts" reply to the German surrender demand became one of the most famous quotes in U.S. military history. Lieutenant Charles Bogus Sherman tank, Cobra King, was the first to reach Bastogne on December 26, 1944. December 20, 1944. The Ardennes forest groaned under a weight of ice and fear. Snow fell like powdered glass, silent and unending, muffling the moans of the wounded scattered across the Belgian town of Bastogne. In the half-light of morning, an American medic named Jack Fisher pressed his bare hands against a soldier's frozen wound, whispering, "Hold on, kid, just hold on." His breath turned to fog, curling into the gray air like smoke from a dying fire. Around him, foxholes were rimmed with frost, rifles jammed with ice, and men stared toward the tree line where the German shells came from. The air was thick with the smell of burnt powder and pine. Somewhere beyond the ridges, German loudspeakers crackled through the snow. "Amerikaner, surrender. You are surrounded." The words echoed, distorted, mocking. Then came laughter, actual laughter, rolling through the cold like thunder. To the German troops pressing the siege, the Americans in Bastogne were finished, cornered rats gnawing on their own despair. Berlin radio called it the comedy of the Ardennes. The once proud U.S. paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, were now, they said, just snow statues waiting for their graves. Inside the ruined town, Major General Anthony McAuliffe's headquarters was a shattered schoolhouse. Windows were blown out, chalk dust mixed with gun smoke. Men huddled around makeshift stoves. Old cans, bits of pipe, burning whatever they could find. Books, ration boxes, splintered furniture. Ammunition was running low. Food was nearly gone. A few soldiers boiled snow for coffee and found a half-frozen potato like buried treasure. Outside, artillery pounded the streets until even the church steeple leaned like a drunk too tired to stand. Civilians who had refused to flee hid in basements, clutching their children. Every explosion made the lamps swing. Above them, the Americans dug in deeper, their uniforms stiff with ice. The temperature dropped to -10. Rifle bolts froze, trucks refused to start. Morphine needles snapped in the cold. Yet when the Germans sent a white flag delegation demanding surrender, McAuliffe scrawled a single word in reply, "Nuts," and handed it back. The messenger looked confused. An officer had to translate it. "It means go to hell." The message spread through the ranks like a spark in dry grass. "Nuts" became a cry, a grin, a kind of faith. Men who could barely stand laughed hoarsely. "That's our general," one said. Still got his humor. They knew they might die, but they would not quit. In the frozen trenches around the town, soldiers whispered to one another about rescue. "Patton'll come," they said. "Old blood and guts won't leave us here." But the reality was grim. The nearest American armored divisions were 150 miles south, cut off by snow and chaos. The German panzer columns had closed every road like steel jaws. To the men trapped in Bastogne, time slowed into hunger and cold. The nights were endless. The sky turned the color of lead, and the wind scraped through holes in their coats. When flares lit the horizon, it looked like the world was cracking open. Machine gun bursts danced through the darkness. At dawn, the bodies were frozen in positions of prayer, or surrender, or rage. The snow swallowed them without mercy. And still, the German loudspeakers taunted, "Give up! You cannot win." The mocking voices called them cowards, amateurs, fools for believing they could hold out against Hitler's last great offensive. Meanwhile, far to the south in Luxembourg, General George S. Patton read the latest dispatch from Bastogne. He was pacing before the fireplace of his field headquarters, his polished helmet gleaming even indoors. Outside, sleet hammered the tents. Staff officers waited nervously as he slammed the report onto the table. "They think they've trapped the 101st?" he growled. "Hell, we're going to trap them." He pointed north on the map, jabbing his finger through the snow-covered Ardennes. "We'll turn the whole Third Army around. 70 degrees. Straight into the fight." A colonel stammered, "Sir, the roads are impassable." Patton cut him off. "I don't care if it snows to hell. We move." The room fell silent. They all knew what he was proposing. To pivot an entire army of 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks and guns, through mountains and blizzards in days. Something no commander in history had ever done. Eisenhower's staff would think he'd lost his mind. But Patton was already dictating orders, his voice sharp and cold as steel. "Tell the men we march for Bastogne. We fight through Christmas. God help the Krauts." That night, word spread across the Third Army camps like an electric current. Patton's turning north. Soldiers stared into the snow, disbelief giving way to pride. They'd followed him across Sicily and France. Now he was asking them to do the impossible. In the black hours before dawn, tank engines coughed to life one by one, belching smoke into the frozen air. Convoys formed like dark serpents across the white plains. Every man knew the name of the town they were going to, Bastogne. Back at the siege, the Americans endured. They scavenged parachute silk to wrap their boots, tore pages from Bibles to light fires. When shells hit, they barely flinched. A paratrooper named Winters wrote in his journal, "If this is hell, it's got snow." Another scratched a note onto his helmet. "For my wife, tell her I stood my ground." The constant shelling turned the town into a graveyard of brick and bone. Horses froze where they fell. Trucks burned until even their metal frames hissed in the snow. Yet the men refused despair. They listened to the distant thunder and imagined it was Patton's guns. They told each other stories, sang half-remembered carols, carved crosses into the ice. Somewhere in the darkness, a soldier played a harmonica softly, its notes trembling in the cold air. It sounded like hope wearing thin, but not gone. Then, on December 23rd, the clouds thinned. For the first time in days, sunlight broke through. A pale, ghostly light, but enough. American planes roared overhead, scattering supply canisters that fell like blessings. Food, ammo, bandages. A box burst open near a foxhole, spilling chocolate bars. Men laughed, cried, hugged each other. The miracle of survival had begun. The Germans saw it too, and their laughter faltered. They redoubled the shelling, desperate to finish the siege before reinforcements arrived. But something had changed in Bastogne. The Americans no longer felt trapped. They felt chosen. Each man believed that somewhere beyond those ridges, Patton was coming. And if they could hold just a little longer, he would break through the snow. Night returned, black and brittle. Fisher the medic lay against a wall, his coat stiff with blood, watching snow drift through a hole in the roof. A faint rumble carried through the air. Not artillery this time, deeper, steadier. He smiled weakly. "That's tanks," he whispered. In the dark forests miles away, Patton's columns were indeed grinding north, their engines echoing through the valleys. The impossible was already in motion. The Germans laughed at the Americans trapped in Bastogne. But in the silence after their laughter faded, a storm was gathering, of engines, of fury, of resolve, that would soon turn that laughter into disbelief. They thought they had surrounded the Americans. They didn't know they had awakened Patton. And the snow itself was about to burn. They said the Americans were finished. They hadn't met Patton's fury. Surrounded, starving, and still they refused to die. What came through the snow would silence the laughter forever. December 21st, 1944. The frozen dawn cracked like glass over Luxembourg. At the Third Army headquarters, steam from coffee cups hung in the air, mingling with the smell of diesel and damp wool. General George S. Patton stood before a massive operations map covered in colored pins, grease pencil lines, and frost along the edges of the tent flaps. Officers crowded around, breath visible, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. A thick silence hovered, broken only by the distant whine of wind outside. Patton tapped the map with his riding crop. "Gentlemen, Bastogne is surrounded," he said, his voice low but sharp. "That means one thing. We can cut our way in or die trying." The staff stared. It was madness. The roads north were buried in snowdrifts, bridges blown out, fuel depots empty. Tanks couldn't move, trucks froze solid overnight. One colonel finally spoke. "Sir, even if we could turn the Third Army north, it would take a week to regroup. We'd never make it in time." Patton's jaw clenched. "Then we'll do it in 3 days." A murmur rippled through the tent. 3 days? The Third Army stretched across eastern France and Luxembourg. A monster of steel and men, hundreds of miles of armor, artillery, and supply chains. To pivot that beast northward through a blizzard was beyond military logic. Yet Patton's blue eyes burned with something fiercer than logic. "Those boys in Bastogne are airborne," he said, his voice rising. "They held the line on D-Day. They'll hold it now, but not alone." He turned to his chaplain, Colonel O'Neill. "I want a prayer," Patton ordered. "For good weather. I'm sick of this damn snow." O'Neill blinked. "A prayer, sir?" "Yes, for a break in the weather so our planes can fly." "But, General, I don't—" "Write it," Patton snapped. "Then print it and distribute it to every man in the Third Army. We're going to pray for clear skies, and when they come, we're going to kill Germans." By noon, tens of thousands of soldiers carried copies of the printed prayer in their pockets. "Almighty and most merciful Father," it began, "grant us fair weather for battle." They read it aloud in the cold, some out of faith, others out of fear. The chaplains led them under the gray sky, voices rising over the wind. Somewhere between faith and fury, morale hardened into destiny. Patton's convoy rolled out first. Jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks crawled up narrow roads, tires spinning in ice. The snow came down sideways, blinding, relentless. Engineers swung picks into frozen earth to clear paths. Mechanics worked by lanterns, thawing fuel lines with torches, cursing under their breath. At night, the wind howled like wolves. Soldiers tied scarves across their faces, frost clinging to their eyelashes. They weren't marching, they were surviving. In one column, Sergeant Jack O'Hara leaned out of his Sherman tank, wind biting his cheeks. He could barely hear the radio through the static. "Keep her moving," his commander shouted. The tracks groaned against the ice. Each mile was a battle against nature itself. Trucks overturned in ditches, artillery pieces buried under snow, men collapsing from exhaustion. Yet no one turned back. The mission, Bastogne or bust, was now sacred. As the convoys pushed north, the German advance seemed unstoppable. Panzer divisions prowled the forests, cutting off roads, torching villages. The sound of tank treads echoed through the valleys like an approaching storm. In Bastogne, the trapped 101st Airborne could hear the growl of enemy armor closing in. The town shook under shellfire. In the cellar of a shattered bakery, Lieutenant Richard Winters scribbled coordinates on a map by candlelight. "We're running out of everything," he muttered to his radio operator. "If Patton doesn't reach us soon, we're done." The operator nodded, too numb to answer. A shell hit nearby, shaking dust from the beams. The candle went out. They sat in the dark, waiting for the next blast. Outside, snowflakes fell over the corpses of both sides. Frozen in grotesque stillness, rifles still clutched in their hands. The battlefront had become a white graveyard. And yet, in the south, something extraordinary was taking shape. On December 23rd, a brief break in the clouds opened over the Ardennes. The gray sky split to reveal a sliver of sunlight. "Sir!" a signal officer cried at Patton's headquarters. "Weather's clearing." Patton smiled grimly. "Then let's give them hell." Within hours, the roar of engines filled the air. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes and gliders lifted off, laden with food, ammo, and medical supplies. Above Bastogne, paratroopers looked up in disbelief as canisters parachuted through the snow. Some crashed, some burned, but many landed safely. One soldier caught a box of ammunition and fell to his knees, laughing uncontrollably. For the first time in days, they felt the sky belonged to them again. Meanwhile, on the ground, Patton's Third Army clawed through the winter. Convoys stretched for miles, headlights dimmed under blackout orders. Men marched beside tanks, boots crunching through ice. In the small town of Ardennes, supply trucks jammed every street. "Keep moving," officers shouted. The cold was merciless. Fuel thickened into sludge, and the smell of frostbitten flesh filled the air. Still, discipline held. Each day, the army advanced closer to Bastogne. The Germans didn't believe it possible. They had calculated that no relief force could cross such terrain before spring. One Wehrmacht colonel reportedly scoffed, "Patton is a showman, not a magician," but he was wrong. By December 24th, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division were within 40 miles of Bastogne. The snow was waist-deep now, the wind cutting like knives. Tanks crawled forward in low gear, exhaust fumes trailing like smoke from dragons. Every bridge they crossed was mined, every hill watched by German guns. The battles were small, brutal, and constant, villages changing hands multiple times a day. In one firefight near Martelange, American tanks ambushed a German convoy hidden under the trees. The air erupted with flame and snow. Private Joseph Leroux watched a panzer explode in front of him, the shockwave knocking him backward. He blinked through the smoke, ears ringing, and shouted to no one, "We're getting through! We're really getting through!" Patton drove ahead of his columns, standing half out of his jeep despite the sleet. His men could barely keep up. "Move faster," he barked. "Those boys are freezing while you're warming your butts in these trucks." His aide begged him to take cover. Patton refused. He needed his army to see him, alive, furious, unstoppable. Christmas Eve arrived under a sky that glowed dimly with tracer fire. The men of Bastogne huddled in their foxholes, hungry and hollow-eyed. The church bells were long gone, but someone found a harmonica and played "Silent Night." A few soldiers sang along softly, their voices trembling. The wind carried the song across the lines. For a fleeting moment, even the guns seemed to pause. Then came the counterattack. The Germans, realizing the relief force was near, hurled everything they had: tanks, artillery, and fanatical SS units. The night sky lit up like dawn. American gunners returned fire until their barrels smoked. Shells burst in the snow, painting it crimson. Back at the front of the 4th Armored Division, Captain William Dwight stood atop his tank, scanning the horizon through snow goggles. "We're 20 miles out," he shouted into the radio. "Tell Bastogne we're coming." The reply crackled faintly, "We'll be here." The next morning, frost glittered on the barrels of Patton's tanks as they pushed forward again. The men were running on fumes. Some hadn't slept in 3 days, but the thought of Bastogne kept them upright. It was no longer just a mission, it was a promise. Every mile now felt like eternity. The closer they came, the harder the Germans fought. Roads vanished under ice. Bridges collapsed behind them. Still they advanced, clawing forward, inch by inch. The blizzard returned with full force, turning the battlefield into a white void. In Bastogne, McAuliffe received a faint radio transmission. Static, then a voice. "Relief. Advancing 2 days." He smiled for the first time in a week. "Tell the men," he said quietly. "Help is on the way." The men cheered, weak but unbroken. They'd survived hunger, cold, and siege. Now, they would live to see Patton's armor crest the horizon. But the question still hung in the frozen air. Could he truly break through before the Germans crushed them once and for all? The snow answered with silence, and the rumble of engines far, far away. December 26, 1944. Dawn crept pale and bitter over the Ardennes. The snow no longer fell softly. It hissed like sand in the wind. The forests looked burned white, trees splintered by artillery, their branches drooping under ice. The world was silent except for one sound. A deep, rolling thunder that grew louder every minute. It wasn't weather. It wasn't bombs. It was the sound of engines, Patton's tanks, grinding their way through the frozen earth toward Bastogne. At the front of the 4th Armored Division, Lieutenant Charles Boggess wiped frost from his periscope and squinted into the fog. His tank, Cobra King, led the column. Inside the turret, the men's faces were gray from exhaustion, their hands numb on the levers. "How far now?" someone shouted. 8 miles, Boggess answered. "Maybe less if we live that long." The Germans were everywhere. Machine gun nests hidden among the trees, mortars waiting along the ridges. The snow muffled their footsteps, but not the rattle of metal. The Americans moved like ghosts, engines rumbling low, breath steaming in the cold air. Behind them, the rest of the 4th Armored rolled in grim procession. Hundreds of Shermans, half-tracks, jeeps, and infantry trudging beside them through drifts waist-deep. The sky hung heavy with storm clouds, and the air smelled of oil and gunpowder. The men had slept only in snatches for days. The cold had frozen their canteens, their cigarettes cracked when lit, and their faces were blistered from windburn. Yet they kept going, whispering one word like a prayer, Bastogne. As they approached the village of Assinois, the snow began to glow faintly from the muzzle flashes ahead. The Germans had dug in hard, determined to stop Patton's spearhead before it reached the trapped 101st. Mortar rounds exploded in fountains of white. "Forward!" Boggess yelled, his voice drowned by the roar of cannon fire. The lead Sherman bucked as its gun thundered, smashing a German position in a barn. Splinters and snow filled the air. Infantry sprinted behind the tanks, slipping, shouting, firing from the hip. One soldier fell, then another, disappearing under a sheet of snow. The road turned to mud under melted ice and blood. "They've mined the approach," the radio crackled. Boggess ignored it. "Keep moving," he ordered. "If we stop, we die." The tank treads screamed as they tore through the slush. Machine guns hammered from the treeline. Bullets sparked off the armor like rain. The gunner inside Cobra King clenched his jaw and fired again and again until the barrel smoked. They blasted through a farmhouse, walls collapsing in a shower of snow and dust. By afternoon, the 4th Armored had lost dozens of men and vehicles, but they had gained ground. Each village they passed was a ruin, chimneys sticking up from the snow like gravestones. Dead horses lay in the ditches, carts overturned, helmets frozen into the mud. In the distance, the church spire of Bastogne appeared faintly through the haze, black against the pale sky. "That's it," Boggess whispered. "That's home." Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was barely holding on. The paratroopers had fought for a week without relief. Their numbers thinned, their supplies nearly gone. Sergeant Don Burgett crouched behind a wall, his rifle shaking from the cold. "Any word yet?" a soldier asked beside him. Burgett shook his head. "Just rumors." They listened to the faraway rumble. It sounded like thunder, or hope. At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King crested the last ridge outside Bastogne. Smoke curled from the town's ruins. German shells still whistled overhead. "Let's go," Boggess shouted. The tank surged forward, crashing through the final barricade. Infantry followed close behind. Snow and dirt exploded around them as artillery landed nearby, shaking the ground. Suddenly, the radio crackled with a faint American voice. "Is that you, boys?" Boggess grinned. "Yeah," he shouted into the mic. "And we brought company." The first tank of Patton's relief column rolled into Bastogne as paratroopers stumbled out of basements and trenches, eyes wide with disbelief. Some ran toward the tanks, laughing, crying, slapping the armor as if to make sure it was real. One soldier leaned against Cobra King, tears freezing on his face. "You sons of bitches actually did it," he said, voice cracking. "You really came." The laughter that once echoed from German loudspeakers was gone now, replaced by the grinding of treads and the cheers of exhausted men. The siege was broken. Patton's army had done the impossible. Marched 150 miles through snow, turned an entire front in 3 days, and smashed into the jaws of the enemy. When word reached German command, disbelief spread like panic. Radio operators reported sightings of Patton's tanks north of Ardennes, then near Neufchâteau, and now in Bastogne itself. "Unmöglich," one officer muttered, "impossible." Hitler's staff refused to believe the reports until photographs came in showing American armor in the town square. The joke of Bastogne had turned into a humiliation for the Reich. Numbers told the story like thunderclaps. In 72 hours, 45,000 men, 600 tanks, 11 divisions, and over 400 artillery pieces had been redirected north through the worst winter Europe had seen in a century. They crossed rivers clogged with ice, fought in whiteout blizzards, and still arrived in time. It was not a rescue, it was a resurrection. Patton himself arrived the next morning, standing atop his jeep as he rolled into the town. The streets were littered with rubble, broken helmets, and burnt-out vehicles. Soldiers saluted weakly as he passed. He doffed his helmet, the 3 stars gleaming in the weak sun, and said simply, "Well, gentlemen, looks like you were never lost after all." McAuliffe met him with a grin. "We were never worried, sir," he said. "We knew you'd make it." The 2 generals stood together among the ruins, the smoke rising around them. Nearby, paratroopers shared cigarettes with tankers, laughing for the first time in days. Someone raised a bottle of frozen cognac found in a wrecked cafe. They passed it around, taking turns drinking to victory, to survival, to Patton. Further east, the German 2nd Panzer Division was retreating under constant air attack. The skies, once choked with snow, were now filled with Allied bombers and fighter planes. The weather prayer had worked, or perhaps it was coincidence or fate. Either way, the clouds had parted, and the storm that once trapped Bastogne now punished the enemy instead. American pilots strafed convoys along the icy roads, turning the once mighty German advance into a desperate rout. The tide had turned completely. Bastogne was no longer a symbol of entrapment. It was a fortress of defiance. American artillery thundered from its outskirts, pounding German positions until the night glowed red. Paratroopers who had once hidden underground now walked openly through the shattered streets, heads high, rifles slung over their shoulders. They had survived the impossible and watched salvation roll in on steel tracks. German prisoners shuffled past, faces pale and hollow. Some still couldn't believe what had happened. "Patton came through the snow?" one asked in disbelief. An American guard nodded. "Yeah," he said. "He always does." By December 27th, the lines around Bastogne had been pushed back miles. The siege was broken for good. Soldiers built fires in the streets, warming their hands, cooking what little food they could scavenge. The sound of engines was constant, Patton's armor spreading like wildfire, driving the Germans out of the bulge they had created. Reporters who arrived days later would call it a miracle of movement. But to the men who lived it, it wasn't a miracle. It was endurance, discipline, and sheer willpower. Patton had turned ridicule into thunder, despair into momentum. That night, under a sky finally clear of clouds, the stars glittered hard and bright. Men who had expected to die stood watch, their breath rising in quiet clouds. From the forest came no laughter now, only the sound of retreating boots crunching in the snow. The once proud German lines were broken, shattered by an army that refused to stop. One paratrooper summed it up best as he watched the tanks rumble past. "They laughed at us," he said softly. "They thought we were trapped. But we were bait. And they bit." And miles away, in his headquarters, Patton wrote in his diary that night, "We have relieved Bastogne. The men have done magnificently. God was with us. The storm had passed. The laughter had died. And from the white inferno of the Ardennes, the legend of Bastogne was born. A story not of defeat, but of the moment when faith, fury, and frozen steel changed the fate of a war." The morning after the relief of Bastogne, the sky was the color of cold steel. Smoke drifted lazily over the ruins, and snowflakes settled softly on burned-out tanks. The air no longer thundered with artillery, only with the low murmur of men too exhausted to celebrate. The 101st Airborne, those ghosts of the siege, shuffled through streets that no longer looked like a town, just a graveyard of stone and twisted metal. Civilians emerged from cellars, blinking in disbelief at the pale daylight. Children stepped over craters to touch the massive Sherman tanks that had clawed their way through the snow to save them. General Anthony McAuliffe walked among his men, his boots crunching on broken glass and ice. He stopped to speak to a medic wrapping a soldier's frostbitten hand. "How's he doing?" McAuliffe asked. The medic looked up, dark circles under his eyes. "Alive," he said. "For now. That's good enough." Behind them, men built fires from door frames, melting snow in helmets to drink. A chaplain moved between the wounded, whispering prayers. Somewhere nearby, someone had found a radio, and a jazz tune crackled faintly through the static. The melody sounded out of place, fragile, but it made a few soldiers smile. Patton arrived that afternoon, his staff trailing behind. His boots sank into the slush as he surveyed the town he'd promised to save. He removed his gloves and looked silently at the wreckage, the shattered buildings, the frozen bodies of both sides lying half-buried in white drifts. The victory was undeniable, but so was the cost. Nearly 20,000 Americans were dead from the wider Battle of the Bulge. Hundreds more would die from frostbite and infection before the new year. "That's the price of freedom," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. The soldiers who could still stand lined up as he passed. They didn't cheer. They just nodded, too tired for ceremony. Patton paused beside one young sergeant sitting on a broken wall, his rifle across his knees. The man saluted weakly. "You made it, sir," he said. Patton's eyes softened. "No," he replied quietly. "You did." He reached into his coat and handed the soldier his own gloves. "Get warm. You'll need those more than I will." Then he moved on, the snow crunching under his boots like brittle glass. The laughter that had echoed from the German lines a week earlier was gone forever. Berlin's propaganda had boasted of trapping the Americans at Bastogne, of breaking their spirit in the snow. But now Radio Berlin was silent on the subject. Hitler's last gamble in the West had shattered against the anvil of American stubbornness. What was meant to split the Allied front had only proven its unbreakable resolve. The German soldiers who survived the retreat trudged eastward, gaunt and disbelieving. They had seen Patton's army carve through blizzards and minefields like a force of nature. Many whispered that no human general could have done it, that he must have been born for war itself. On the American side, the story spread like wildfire. Newspapers called it a Christmas miracle. Families back home read about their sons who had refused to surrender, who had held Bastogne while the world thought them doomed. Photographs of paratroopers smiling amid the ruins appeared on front pages across the United States. Mothers wept with pride and grief. In cafes, people pointed at maps, tracing Patton's advance with trembling fingers. He had turned a desperate winter into a symbol of American endurance. But victory carried its shadows. The men who had fought at Bastogne would never forget what they'd seen. The frozen corpses in white fields, the friends who froze beside them, the sound of shells screaming through the night. It stayed with them long after the medals were pinned. Many could never sleep through a quiet snowfall again. It reminded them too much of that week in Belgium when the sky was ash, and every breath felt borrowed. In the weeks that followed, the Allies pushed the Germans back across the Ardennes. The bulge in the lines that Hitler had created collapsed, and the road to Germany reopened. Patton's men advanced relentlessly, the fires of Bastogne still burning in their minds. In January, they reached the Siegfried Line. The frozen rivers ran red as they crossed into enemy territory. Every mile carried the weight of what they had endured. The men joked less now. They moved with a grim, steady purpose. The laughter of the enemy had taught them what pride could cost. When Patton was asked by reporters how he managed such a turnaround, he gave a simple answer: "I had the best damn soldiers in the world." But in private, he wrote in his diary, "It was the weather that broke them. The Lord himself opened the skies for us." Whether it was faith or sheer defiance that drove him, no one could deny what had happened. Bastogne had become a legend, a living reminder that courage can hold even when logic says it shouldn't. The irony of it all hung in the air. The Germans had laughed at the Americans trapped in the snow. They thought the siege would be quick, easy, inevitable. But the insult became prophecy reversed. Bastogne was no longer a place of humiliation. It was a shrine to endurance. Soldiers who had been mocked as victims became the victors who refused to die quietly. They said we were finished, one paratrooper wrote in his journal, but we outlasted the snow. Years later, historians would call it the defining moment of the Ardennes campaign. Military academies studied Patton's maneuver as a masterclass in mobility and morale under impossible conditions. Pilots still quoted the weather prayer as an example of leadership that defied logic and relied on belief. But for the men who had lived through it, the lesson was simpler: hold the line no matter what. McAuliffe, reflecting years later, said, "It wasn't glory that kept us there. It was each other." That truth lingered long after the guns fell silent. The survivors of Bastogne carried the frost in their bones and the pride in their hearts. Each Christmas after the war, many gathered quietly in American Legion halls, toasting with whiskey or coffee, remembering the week when everything froze except their courage. On the other side of the world, General Patton's name became legend, sometimes caricatured, sometimes revered. But in Bastogne, his soldiers remembered him not as a distant general, but as the man who kept his word. He said he'd come, a veteran once told a reporter decades later. And by God, he did, through hell and snow both. The moral of Bastogne was more than military, it was human. When surrounded by darkness, the instinct is to surrender. But history belongs to those who refuse. The Americans at Bastogne were not supermen. They were cold, starving, and scared. What made them immortal was that they held anyway. Patton's words still echo. "It is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died. Rather, we should thank God that such men lived." He wrote that after the battle, standing before rows of wooden crosses, the wind tugging at his coat. He saluted once, then turned away. He knew history would remember their stand long after the snow had melted. In the final days of that winter, as the fires burned down and the wounded were evacuated, a young soldier carved something into the wall of a ruined building. It read, "We were cold. We were hungry. We were surrounded. But damn it, we were still Americans." And so the story ended where it began, with laughter. But now, the laughter came not from the enemy, but from the survivors themselves, sitting beside their fires, telling the tale of how the world thought they were finished and how they refused to die. It was tired laughter, cracked and weary, but it carried the music of victory. They had proven that, even in the darkest winter, courage burns hot enough to melt the snow. And as history turned its page, one question remained. If tomorrow brought another Bastogne, would we still have men willing to hold the line?